Hey Gulfstream readers, we're here with David Lehman, a scholar and poet, and he's agreed to talk to us for a little while. So let's just get on into it, David.
It's nice to be here.
Yeah, it's nice to have you. So I asked you this question earlier through email, but I'll ask it again. In your poem, January 1st, from the Daily Mirror, the speaker talks about confusing inspiration with lightning, and that the speaker has a command over inspiration. Do you, as a poet, still have that kind of command, even though you finished those 2 books of daily poems? Or does inspiration just kind of strike at random for you?
Well, that's a very good question, and I like the way you use the word command, because that word is in my poem of January 1, and in French, commander means to order something. And in that poem, I think it's like it's at my command, the same way that you can order a turkey club sandwich with split pea soup.
Right.
And I think it's true that you should be open always to inspiration when it hits, and that's not predictable. But there are days when you don't feel particularly inspired, and I believe you can generate your own inspiration on such days, and that the blank computer screen or piece of paper need not inhibit you, and that there are many ways to kickstart your imagination.
Can you talk a bit about some of those ways? Because I know as beginning, I still call myself a beginning writer just because I'm still in school and learning. What are those ways to kind of make it happen when we can't find inspiration?
Well, one very good way is to write in a form. Every form, even the most venerable, like the sonnet, is at its heart a kind of game, where in the case of a sonnet, you fit your thoughts into 14 lines. You use a rhyme scheme where you don't. You turn after the 8th line. And there are more complicated forms like the sestina, where there's 6 recurring words that end all of the lines. These games distract you from writing the poem. So the poem gets written while you solve the puzzle of the poem. There are many other kinds of word games that you can play. For example, every line has to have a word and an anagram of the same word. Would be an interesting thing. Or do you know what an abecedarius is?
Yes, I do.
Oh, well, that's a great one. That the first line begins with A, the second with B. So that your whole thought is like, how am I going to get A to Z? And somehow the poem gets taken care of. Another thing you can do is to imitate. Imitate a poet. Whether it's a great poet from the past or a recent poet. Whether it's John Keats or John Ashbery. I think immersing yourself in the work of that poet and then immediately writing a poem trying to use the mannerisms you associate with that poet would be a way of creating the space so that you don't need the lightning inspiration, which can still happen.
That's really cool. Good suggestions. So you've talked about the surprising initial success of the Best American Poetry series. And the series is still going strong, so that does speak to the relevance of poetry, or the best poetry. So where do you see poetry's place in pop culture right now? Do you think it's important or just kind of marginalized?
Well, it's hard to answer that question. It's hard to answer the question of what poetry's place is in the general culture. But your question is more specific to the popular culture.
Right.
And poetry is not exactly a popular art. It hasn't been for a while. But it can still survive and flourish in the periphery, in the same way that jazz music can. Now, there was a time when, if you turned on the radio, you heard a kind of jazz in the 1940s. When we were in the car just now, you said, oh, I like that station. Popular music in the 1930s and 40s involved a lot of jazz improvisations to a certain extent. You didn't lose the melody, as in bop jazz, but jazz now is no longer what you hear when you turn the radio on, which I think is too bad because it's a great indigenous American art form. but it does survive, not only in this country, but elsewhere. And especially in a city like New York, where I live, there are many places you can go and hear jazz or hear a cabaret singer. And I would liken poetry in its way to jazz or serious drama or other things that have a precarious existence in a society that's rapidly changing and that has embraced technology to a tremendous extent. But there's still room for poetry. You can think of it like the public broadcasting system. The ratings are very tiny compared to the ratings of a major network, but it does thrive,
right.
And they have hit programs. And Best American Poetry has proved itself to be a very good publishing idea. We're 25 years old, and we have a real following every year, which I think means that poetry matters to people. It matters to the people who write it. It matters to the people who read it, and they're not always the same people.
Right. So dovetailing off of the technology comment you made, I kind of wondered where you see poetry going with that kind of thing. Like, do you think Best American will ever publish a Twitter poem, for example? And I know you guys had the motion poem project for the last issue.
I happen to love all kinds of competitions and games and stunts myself. I like nothing better than to be in a situation where they say, okay, you have 1 hour to write a poem, this is the subject. So I think that there's a lot of it. Not everyone likes playing, but I do. And my friend Kevin Young, who was the guest editor of the 2011 book, just did a thing with NPR where he spent a day at the studios of National Public Radio and wrote a poem based on the news of the day. Robert Pinsky did that also, and Craig Morgan Teicher. They're doing a series like that. I think a lot of right-minded people want to do things with poetry. That's one thing. When the internet was new, I was volunteered by, I can't even remember who, to come to the studio, spend 2 hours there, and write poems in response to questions that would come in from people around the country. This was when even email was a relatively new thing. This was back in like 97.
Oh, wow.
And we did that. And there was an outfit that called Quick Muse, where they give you a prompt at, let's say, 10 a.m., and you have until 11 a.m. to write the poem based on the prompt.
Like
or no, they give you 15 minutes.
Whoa,
15 minutes. 15 minutes. They give you usually a quote. Or, in fact, maybe I should read a poem tonight from the Quick Muse poems.
Awesome.
Well, we had 4 quotes, and we had an hour to write 4 poems, 15 minutes each. And then they preserve your keystrokes.
Oh, wow, okay.
So that you have the poem itself, but also the keystrokes. So they can tell how you wrote the poem, when you erased the line, or when...
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Quick Muse it's called. But that's just one of many ways of sort of using the technology. And also we're making a segue into electronic publishing. More and more magazines will be online as opposed to in print. And the prestige remains with the print magazines at this point.
Right.
That's changing.
Yeah, our Gulfstream magazine's actually all online now.
It is?
So, there you go.
Well, it's a lot less expensive to do it that way. And that's the wave of the future. That's going to happen. But when you do something online, you can also do something, you know, interesting that capitalizes on the technology. That is, you're losing something when you're not a print magazine. You're losing the object that someone can hold in his hand or her hand. So there's, you know, something given up. But maybe on the computer screen there's some extra thing you can do that compensates for it.
Okay. So let's skip down to a more meaty question. So we're studying prose poetry in our form and theory class with Denise, and I've been kind of interested in the way that we classify prose poems. I'm thinking particularly of Triptych by Paul Violi. I don't know if you remember it.
I do remember it, and Paul was a very close friend of mine. Unfortunately, he passed in April of 2011. But I chose that triptych, and it's in 3 parts, morning, afternoon, evening. It's based on TV guide listings.
Right. Yeah.
And it's very clever use of form.
Yeah. So that actually made me think, you know, why is this particular form a prose poem if a prose poem is usually defined as just a block of poetry?
Oh, I see. I don't define prose poem that narrowly and say that it's a block of paragraph, because many prose poems could consist of 3 or 4 paragraphs, but also most of the language we encounter is prose. For example, a newspaper is prose. There's the editorial page, the letters to the editor, the op-ed, articles, reviews. What Paul Violi did was take a print medium form that had nothing to do with poetry, listings for television, and he appropriated it for poetry. And if you regard TV Guide as a prose source, then that makes it a prose poem.
That actually makes a lot of sense, because I went back and forth with myself when I read an assignment to try to define a prose poem, which is hard, but that does make a lot of sense.
Well, I would define a prose poem as a poem that's either entirely or primarily in prose.
Right.
And that's a very simple statement. Then you could say, well, in that case, well, what is prose? Well, prose is writing that goes to the end of the page rather than writing that's in lines where the beginning and end of the line both are determined by the poet, which is verse.
Right.
So it's a pretty simple concept, although not one that was met without resistance. The idea that you could write a poem in prose. A lot of people thought that poetry was verse. But verse is one medium for poetry, and there could be prose. And when you read a book like the Great American Prose Poems Anthology, I hope it encourages you to think of, like, what form do I see in my life that might work as a poem, like a menu, maybe.
Right, yeah. Yeah, Denise calls those non-literary forms.
Yes.
So I guess that's a widely accepted term for the genre, but it still would be...
You could call it a non-literary form, an ad hoc form.
Ad hoc?
Yes. That means, you know, just for this one time.
Okay.
Some people would call it maybe nonce forms. There could be 10 phrases for it, but they all mean the same thing.
I see. All right, well, I think we're almost out of time. So thank you so much for doing this interview with us, Dave. It was really enlightening.
Well, you have to tell me, now that if we haven't run out of time entirely, what assignment did Denise Duhamel give you that you found particularly interesting?
What I was just referencing, or any?
Anything.
Well, in general...
I think she's great.
Yeah.
Great teacher.
In general, the whole class has just been interesting for me, because we're studying the form of the prose poem and its limitations and constraints, I guess. And just kind of delving into that has been really interesting, just because I don't really write a lot of prose poems at all. And it's kind of interesting to see the line between a prose poem and like flash fiction, for example, because they seem kind of close, but you know, there's some characteristics of poetry that are still in the prose poem. But you can also be poetic in flash fiction.
Well, I don't know how really you can discriminate between a prose poem and flash fiction, if you call it that, or sudden fiction. Sometimes they call it that. Short.
Right.
There's no real solid way of discriminating one thing from the other. I guess instinct. But there's a poet named Lydia Davis, and a lot of times her work is classified as fiction because she writes these very, very short stories, like 4 sentences long.
Wow.
And I think of them as prose poems. But it sort of doesn't matter how you categorize them. I think one of the ideas of the prose poem is to write something that resists categorizing, that doesn't comply with all the traditional practices. I think that must be one of the attractions.
Yeah. So I guess we shouldn't try to force them into a box.
For sure.
Right.
For sure. It's meant to be a liberation to write to do something that's new, that wasn't done before.
That's really neat. I'm going to share that with Denise for sure on Monday.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, I'll have to read a prose poem tonight.
Yes, of course. Thank you again so much for coming and for doing the interview with us.